Okay, now let's talk about chapter 13. Let's begin chapter 13 talking about predators and herbivores, organisms that eat something else. They have what you would call an exploitation type relationship. One species is benefiting and exploiting the other. It starts with the famous example of the lynx and the hare. They live in these cold northern climates. The lynx being the predator and the hare being the prey. Um, and as we can see here, we have these generalizations. Predators tend to have broader diets. Herbivores, like the hare, tend to have a more narrowly focused diet. And long-term look at these two interacting species, we see this cycle that develops in which the hare population increases, the brown line, and then the lynx population tends to increase after that. Again, some years more of them, some years fewer of them, but again, throughout this cycle going throughout time, I want you to notice the difference in the scales. Here's the hare over here and the lynx over here. And when we look at the hare specifically, we see that there's this relationship between density and reproductive rate. When the hares are at relatively low density, they have higher reproductive rates, and when they're at high densities, they have lower reproductive rates. That perhaps makes a bit of sense because when there's fewer of the hares, there should be more resources for the females and their reproductive rates should increase. And on the other hand, when there are lots of hares around, there'll be fewer resources for the mother hares and fertility will decrease. Um, so it appears that a direct relationship between this predator and prey is causing this relationship. At least that's one explanation. We'll, at the end of the chapter, we'll discuss it a bit more and see perhaps that there might be a little more to the story. All right, so here are these different types of exploitation relationships: herbivores and the plants they eat, predators and the prey that they eat, parasites and their hosts. A particular kind of parasite known as a parasitoid is quite interesting. They are these wasps that lay their eggs on a host, another insect. The larva feeds on it from the inside out, and then once it's mature, it will emerge and break out of that host, and the host is essentially killed. A rather insidious relationship, you might say. Foraging strategies of organisms as they go out there to find food can vary a great deal from working as an individual to working in groups, um, relying on speed versus hiding, blending in and waiting for the prey or the food to come to you. Again, the diet can vary a great deal from being very wide-ranging, broad diet to be a relatively narrowly focused diet. Um, and the foods you eat can, of course, vary over time. Here's an experiment in which they study these fish that eat, among other things, these worms, these tubificid worms that live in ponds and lakes. And so the green line is sort of what you would expect if the proportion of the worms in the environment was equal to the proportion of the worms in the fish's diet. That is, if the worms made up 20% of the prey items out there, then of course they would be 20% of the diet of the fish. But what you see is it doesn't quite fit. It sort of drops below the green line and then above the green line. Well, what's going on there? Well, essentially when the prey is a relatively small proportion of the total prey out there, when the worms are a small proportion of the total prey, the fish tends not to eat them as much as they would otherwise. However, when the worms make up a greater proportion of the prey out there, that is, the worm population is quite large, then the fish focuses on them much more. They're easier to find and it becomes a very big part of their diet. Um, Essentially, when the worm is at a lower population, you can imagine it will switch to something else and the worms aren't eaten nearly as often. Um, when organisms are out there foraging, they'll have a search image. They'll kind of know what they're looking for. Um, I think of this when I'm at a place like Kroger and I kind of know what I'm looking for and where it is, and I can get in there and get in and out pretty quick. But then, of course, if they move things around, it slows me down. So animals will be the same way when they're out there foraging for plants. If they're herbivores or prey, if they're predators, they'll kind of know where things are, what they're looking for. And that can be an innate knowledge that they have or a learned behavior. We'll study that. We'll talk about that when we study behavior. Herbivores have to go out there, of course, and find food, and the food varies a great deal in nutritional quality. This is looking at the nitrogen content of different kinds of foods. Of course, animals themselves have lots of nitrogen in them. Plants less so, but they vary a great deal in the parts of their plants that have a lot of food. Of course, what is it that, or have a lot of nitrogen? Um, what is it that herbivores mostly eat? Well, they mostly eat leaves and seeds, and not surprisingly, those are the parts of plants that have the most nutrient content. The needles of evergreens like pines and stuff have less so. They tend not to be eaten quite as much as the leaves of broadleaf species like oaks and hickories and maples, things like that. So herbivores, of course, can have a significant impact on plant populations and consume a great deal of those seeds. But as we've talked about, um, what's the plant strategy when it's faced with all this consumption of their seeds? Well, they essentially just increase the amount of seeds. They produce a large quantity of seeds to compensate for all that consumption of their seeds. Um, and again, herbivores tend to be somewhat more narrowly focused when it comes to their food supply. This is looking at these um, different kinds of this particular kind of uh, insects, and so there's different species within this group, um, and so you can see that within this group of insects, the vast majority of them consume basically just a single type of plant. And the ones that eat a large number of plants is relatively rare. So you can imagine when you're focusing on just one type of plant, you can have a pretty significant impact on that plant population. All right, adaptations. So we've talked about different ways in which organisms go out there and get food, but then there's, of course, also the other side of the coin. You want to avoid becoming food. Um, and so these adaptations are very broad and been shaped by the evolutionary process. Of course, some organisms have armor. This is a pangolin, a relatively interesting organism. Some have spines like porcupines to try to keep things from eating them. Um, some take advantage of bright colors, and these guys are essentially advertising that they are toxic. Um, this is known as aposematic coloring. Aposematic. It's the opposite of camouflage, you might say. And down here we have camouflage. And so other animals essentially hide or blend in as best they can, looking like a leaf or a stick, for example. And this is generally known as crypsis, essentially blending in. Whoops. Others use mimicry, and this is when you're essentially mimicking some other kind of dangerous animal. So this is actually a worm, but it's mimicking looking like a snake that is poisonous. And so some predator has learned not to mess with this snake, and they'll see this and say, oh, I don't want to mess with that, even though that thing is probably perfectly edible and harmless, but it's mimicking something that is dangerous. Of course, a very common strategy is just to be fast, using your speed to try to run away from things that are attempting to eat you. Um, Behavioral methods, of course, you can use warning signals like this prairie dog here as they live in these groups, and some of them stand guard and look for predators, and when they come around, they'll bark and let others know. You can, in addition to hunting in groups, you can use the group mentality, or essentially being in a herd. There's protection in the herd, there's strength in numbers. These are these musk ox that live in these groups, and they sort of form a circle when predators are around, and the larger, stronger ones on the outside, attempting to keep the predators at bay. Um, Now, as with often with these strategies, there's trade-offs involved. Um, so, for example, there are these snails, and there's these different species of snails that these crabs prey upon. The crabs grab them and try to crack open the shell and eat the snail. And essentially, there's a relationship. Some of the snails have thinner shells, and some have thicker shells. Um, the ones with thinner shells, it doesn't take the crabs nearly as long to crack them open as it does with the ones with the thicker shells. But the ones with thinner shells are able to, and you might not think about this with the snails so much, but they're able to get away faster. They can move faster. And so, again, here's where that trade-off is. One strategy is to be quicker, but you have to have a thinner shell in order to do that. Other is to, you're not nearly as quick, but you produce a thicker shell that will hopefully be resistant to the crab and won't be able to crack it open. Again, just different strategies that animals will have. Now, you might think it'd be beneficial to be fast and have a thick shell, but those are somewhat incompatible, you might say. Of course, with herbivory, plants, how do they do that? Well, of course, we already mentioned how they can produce lots of seeds to produce so many seeds that not all of them could possibly be eaten. There's also this, what we call compensation, and that is plants that are eaten, that is, parts of them are eaten, not the whole plant, but parts of them will stimulate growth. And so these pictures here, you can see this is this plant that's growing, and when something eats it or your parts are essentially clipped off, it will sort of become bushier and produce more flowers than if it's never clipped at all. And this is something that gardeners know, that if you basically trim the tips off of the shoots of plants, it'll stimulate more lateral growth, and the plant will become bushier and often produce more flowers. Um, and so essentially the plant is compensating for its loss of vegetation, so therefore it attempts to produce more to compensate for that lost vegetation. Now, obviously, if the whole plant is taken, that can't happen, but it's usually if just part of it is taken. Of course, plants can have structural defenses like spines. Obviously, cactus is a good example of this, to keep things from eating you. There can also be chemical defenses, or these induced defenses, and that is when herbivory, if there's a population of plants and some herbivore comes through and they're starting to eat those plants, that can stimulate the plants to produce particular compounds, what are referred to as these secondary compounds, that make the plant less palatable and in some cases can be outright toxic. We call them secondary compounds because they're not compounds that are absolutely necessary for the plant to grow and survive, but they're produced in response to this herbivory. And these are these plants called vincas that produce some of these things. And some of these compounds, these two in particular, have been made use of in medicine because they have medicinal properties. All right, I'm going to stop there because I'm almost out of time, and this is going to take a little bit of time to explain, so I'll get back to that in the next video.